we'll be in touch soon. All right. So our next speaker who's this guy? I don't know. Forget. We invited him and he accepted. I'm not sure where he came from. No. So Dr. David Stuart, please, you're welcome to unmute and video yourself.
Hey guys.
Hey, I can see. Oh, you have a cat.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Who is with you?
I have my assistant who will be handling the PowerPoints
okay, good.
this evening, who's right here.
I have full faith in his capabilities. Those paws look very prehensile. So Dr. David Stuart is professor, the Linda Shiley Professor of Art History at University of Texas at Austin. Has been working for a little bit in the Maya world and a contributor of Maya epigraphy since his most tender age. He is also co-founder and the leader of the Boundary and Archaeology Research Center, a very awesome not-for-profit that is kind of a sister nonprofit or brother nonprofit to AFAR that both Matt and I also help work on. So Dr. David Stuart is going to basically grace us with kind of, I guess, his transformation, historiographic biography of changes in Maya historical archaeology, shall we call that. The name of his presentation is Maya Archaeology and History, Personal Reflections on a Changing Field from 1980 to 2020. That marks two full cartoons there. So thank you so much, Dave, for joining us today. And you have the floor.
Well, thank you, Max. Thank you, Matt. Good to see you guys. And also thank you to Mallory and Jocelyn for their really great talks. Wonderful way to kind of segue into what I'm going to be talking about today. My presentation today, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen.
Please go ahead.
Make sure this works. So I hope you can see that. Let me know, Max, if that's not quite visible. But yeah, so my presentation today this evening is for me a bit unusual. I'm not going to be presenting any new, research or decipherments of anything or analyses of iconography. Instead, given the topic that Max was emailing me about earlier this summer, which was this idea of Maya archaeology as a historical archaeology or a type of historical archaeology, I thought I would offer some reflections based on, well, what Max just said, which is that, I got an early start in this field back in the 1970s. That's over 40 years ago. When Max brought up this topic, which I think is a very interesting and important one, I very quickly went to this place in my mind thinking that, back in 1977 or 1978 or, thereabouts, Maya archaeology was a very, very different place, a different field. And I wanted to see if I could maybe bridge that particular era, at least as I remember it, as a pretty young person, with where we are today. The transformation in my archaeology it goes without saying, right, has been just remarkable in now over 40 years. And even when I was a graduate student in the very early 1990s, I think, we were wrestling with some of these changes that were coming almost on a weekly basis. And what do you think about that? I don't know. She will comment. And so, I thought it would be an opportunity to talk about the way the field has changed since, the late 70s, early 1980s. And even do a little bit of a deeper historiography is a backdrop to that. So I have a number of slides. I'm going to get through this, I think, fairly quickly. But I do want to caution that I haven't really given a talk like this before, where I'm reflecting on kind of my own personal background in all of this. You know, every person who has, and there are many of you, I think, who are even listening to this, you know, saw these changes, right? Saw these changes even from the 70s and 80s and later, and have their own kind of take on it. So this one is mine, right? This one is kind of a particular kind of perspective. So in the end, I think when I wrap up tonight, I'm going to maybe offer some kind of shallow reflections about where my archaeology is right now, as opposed to where it was just a couple of generations ago. So I'm aging myself a little bit in this talk, but hey, that's life, right? Let's get into the slides. I thought I would start with this image. It's one of my favorite images from a particular era in Maya archaeology. This is a photograph taken at the site of Dos Pilas, Guatemala, by Ian Graham, my old co-worker and mentor in many ways on the Corpus project. And he took this photograph in the very early 1960s, right when Dos Pilas was discovered. This was an era when many sites were still being discovered. In fact, El Mirador, which was known at that time, Ian was really the first one to map it and really document it. So it was a remarkable time in Maya archaeology, kind of bridging this old era of raw exploration, much like Mahler and Maudsley, with the more kind of scientific era of the new archaeology, right? So this was another kind of transformation that was taking place at the time. And I thought I would start with this image of the hieroglyphic stairway that he documented. This is part of Hieroglyphic Stairway 2 at Dos Pilas, now a very well-known historical inscription about a king named Baha Chankawil, who Simon talked about last night. And as you can see here, you know, finding a role for texts and history in Maya archaeology. One simple point to make right here is that in 1961 or 62, when this photograph was taken, I'm not sure exactly that year, there was no real history per se about Maya archaeology. It was right in the wake of Tatiana Proskuriakov's famous paper from 1960, which many of you know about, which proposed the existence of names, of personal names and royal history in the monuments of Piedras Negras, right? So that was an idea that was transformational and quite radical at the time. But one of the things looking back on it is how long it took for that idea to stick, right, in the larger kind of methodologies of Maya archaeology. I think it took a good couple of decades almost for that to really merge well with archaeology. So this photograph encapsulates many of these ideas, right, because it comes at this very interesting time period. There was no real role for texts and history in Maya archaeology, let's say in 1960 or 1962. Beyond the old-fashioned, you know, documenting of texts, which Ian, of course, was a master at, but, you know, the recording of dates, the reading of dates in the way that Sylvanus Morley did for many decades, you know, that was in some ways still kind of the flavor of epigraphy in this era, despite the advances that were being made by Tanya and others. So I think it's one of those periods that's so interesting intellectually, in intellectual history or historiography of Maya archaeology. And taking a much broader perspective, right? And I don't want to, you know, overstate things too much here, but the way I look at, you know, where my archaeology was in this period, where there was a rather intense archaeological history, right? There were many sites that had been dug, and there were you know, basic questions being asked about the Maya collapse in the 60s. There were basic questions about social process, basic questions about all sorts of things. But the texts at that point didn't really enter into a lot of that, right? That came later. And I see Maya archaeology as this very interesting illustration of a reversal of what had happened over a long period of time in the old world, especially in the Mediterranean, in classical archaeology, for example, where, you know, in Egypt, in the study of ancient Greece and ancient Rome, text-based analyses or texts, epigraphy, really came in many ways earlier than the archaeology, right? So the ability to read Egyptian inscriptions in the early 1800s or mid 19th century, that was well before any kind of serious archaeology in Egypt. And so that created a certain dynamic in those fields, in the world of classics, right? In the world of Egyptology, that those fields are even still struggling with in many ways, I think. But Maya archaeology is sort of the flip of that, right? There was a, not a very long period, but a extended period of serious archaeology well before the inscriptions were legible, before they were readable. And I think this created a certain amount of, well, there were tensions in the field, certainly as a result of that. There was its own dynamic that, you know, maybe some of the younger generation of my archaeologists today weren't that aware of. But I was certainly aware of them, and I think others were in the 1970s and 1980s in particular. A real tension between epigraphy on one side, archaeology on the other. And I don't really want to over stress this, but you know, I do remember that there were some arguments that went on at conferences and in other places about some of this stuff, and some of those were persistent debates about the relevance of history, the relevance of epigraphy in broader interpretations. Another thing to keep in mind along the same lines here is that Maya archaeology in the very early days, in the early 20th century, talking here 1910, you know, the first decades, and you can track it back, of course, earlier, the Harvard project at Copan in the 1890s and so forth. But the Quiriguá project I see as a very important kind of historical, theoretical episode in Maya studies. This was a project that began around 1910, and it was organized kind of with the cooperation of several institutions. It was funded by the, really by the banana industry, right? The, you know, Quiriguá being right in the middle of the United Fruit Company lands, right? So they funded this project. It was very colonialist, if you want to use a kind of modern spin on it and analysis of it. And Sylvanus Morley, you know, the great epigraphic figure, archaeological figure in Maya studies, was very much a part of that early project. Another person who was involved was Edgar Lee Hewitt. And Morley and Hewitt, you know, some people know this well, others maybe not so much. Both Morley and Hewitt were really by training Southwestern archaeologists, right? They came from North America. They were training at the School of American Research in Santa Fe, which was really being established in those years and a little bit later. And you can track, in other words, some of the firm roots of Maya field archaeology back to the American Southwest in this area. So this is why I call Maya by Southwest. It's, you know, the seeds of many of the major institutions and players in Maya archaeology came from North America. Why is this relevant? Well, the reason I'm bringing this up is because the tradition of North American archaeology in 1910 and also in 2010 is in many ways not really that comfortable with the idea of history, right? North American archaeology began, its foundations began in this kind of ahistorical perspective, okay? So it almost existed as a counterpart to the old world text-based, epigraphic, kind of focused classical archaeology. I'm kind of oversimplifying this intellectual history in a big way, but I would say that this connection to North American intellectual history and archaeology through Harvard, through the School of American Research, through some other institutions is quite important, right? And it what happens later in terms of some of these tensions, right, that come some decades later between the dialogue of history and archaeology. Again, just to review here, there's a huge shift, as I mentioned, right after mid-century. These are three players that I would like to focus on or mention. Heinrich Berlin, Tatiana Proskuryakov, and David Kelly. I mentioned Proskuryakov, right? She's very famous because of her analysis of the Piedras Negras monuments and the identification of rulers' names and rulers' events and life events. That was in 1960. But before that, Heinrich Berlin had published some remarkable, very insightful articles about the identification of personal names in Maya inscriptions and emblem glyphs, right? The identification of these titles, these possible place names that we now know are the designations for royal courts and royal dynasties. But Berlin, I think, deserves a bit more credit than maybe he gets for helping to set the stage for this paradigm shift. It's interesting that both Berlin and Proskuryakov were together in the field on the Mayapan project in the 1950s up in Yucatan, right? So I suspect they were in dialogue with each other about many of these ideas. And Proskuryakov, really had a baseline from which to work with, in her work in 1960. Maybe surprising to some, I would include also David Kelly in this. Why include Dave? Well, Dave, shown here with Peter Matthews, who was his student at the University of Calgary, his undergraduate student. Dave was, I think, really important for a couple of reasons. He very famously was an early advocate for the phonetic decipherments of Yuri Konorosov, right? He was almost like a lone voice in this idea that Maya writing was phonetic in some of its structure, and advocated for Konorosov's basic methodology. Even though we know now that Konorosov was wrong about a bunch of his readings, the vast majority of his actual decipherments turned out not to be correct. But Kelly knew that he was onto something. The other thing that Dave Kelly did, though, was he followed up immediately on Proskuriakov's ideas by analyzing, for example, in a paper that he wrote just a couple of years later on the rulers of Quirigua, that site that Hewitt and Morley had worked on just 5 decades before. And that was, I think, important in showing that this methodology could be applied elsewhere, right? So, the early 60s, Ian is in the field, he's documenting Dos Pilas and a bunch of other sites. This is when this historical paradigm is emerging, but keep in mind, there are so few scholars who are actually doing this at the time, right? It's just a handful of people. There's no email, there's no internet. Communication is a bit, tricky sometimes, I think. But nevertheless, it helps plant what happens later. Now, the other thing I want to mention here is the Tikal project. Okay, so concurrent with this, in fact, right when Ian is beginning his explorations in the Maya lowlands in Guatemala, especially, the University of Pennsylvania begins its Tikal project in the late 50s, 56 or so, with Ed Shook. And for well over a decade is doing a lot of field work. And it remains today, I think, one of the great excavations in all of Maya archaeology. But remember that the Penn project, when it was going strong, if you go back and read the articles in Expedition Magazine, or if you read the reports, most of them, there's very little reference to history. There's very little reference to rulers' names or reigns or anything like that. It's rather old school. Ed Shook goes back to the Carnegie days of Mayapan and the Washaktun project, right? So there's that bridge back to the early days of Maya archaeology. I think the 60s are this interesting illustration of, archaeology on one side that is kind of continuing along in a certain pathway. And then you have this new epigraphy, this new paradigm of history. They're not necessarily coming together at this point at all, right? That takes some time. And the excavations are sort of winding down at Pennsylvania at Tikal, and they're doing these deep excavations, very Carnegie style, old style deep excavations, moving a lot of earth, tearing down pyramids even, and they find all these burials. They find this deep archaeological sequence in the North Acropolis, especially, which you see at the top of that slide there. And this is that trench through the North Acropolis, rather famous in my archaeology, all the way back into the late preclassic, right? So bridging centuries and centuries of time. Some projects had done a little bit of this. Washoktun is a good example, but Tikal, really helped frame my archaeology for a long, long time based on this chronological approach. But it's a very ahistorical, it's a very non-historical approach to Tikal itself. Now, I was barely able to contribute to that project. In 1968, I visited Tikal. Here I am looking at Temple One. I could have contributed, but they wouldn't really listen to me. I was only 3 years old, so it was a lost opportunity on their part. But hey, there I was, kind of soaking in Temple One, and that was quite a memory. I think my earliest actual memory is Temple One of Tikal. So now we're getting into my biography here, just a sneak preview. Two people I do want to mention though in relation to Tikal. Clemency Coggins and also Christopher Jones, names that may be familiar to you. And you see there a slide of a royal tomb, one of many found by the Penn Project, right? With a long count date painted on the wall. Now, Chris was one of the first in the mid 1970s. He was on the Penn Project, right? He knew Tikal like nobody else. And working with the inscriptions and documenting them, he identified 3 rulers' names in the inscriptions, 3 late classic rulers. He called them ruler A, B, and C in a very famous paper in American Antiquity. And he was spot on about that. He was using Proskuriakov's methods. And I think that's a really nice example in the 70s of where epigraphy and archaeology start to come together, right? Another person who's important with regard to the Penn Project is Clemency Coggins. She was not in the field so much with Penn, but she was Tatiana Proskuriakov's student at Harvard. And Tanya was very aware of what was going on at Tikal, and Clemency wrote a really important dissertation in 1975, I think, or 76, on called The Painting and Drawing Styles of Tikal, which sounds very art historical. It was an art history dissertation. But what she does in that dissertation is she, much like Chris, she's framing all of this in terms of actual rulers of Tikal. And what she's doing is she's channeling Tatiana Proskuriakov's insights about Tikal history. I'll come back to that in a second. But Tanya was, after her Piedras Negras paper, she was still working on Maya history. She just wasn't publishing a lot of articles. Many of her insights come through Clemency, they come through Joyce Marcus, other students who are going through Harvard, especially in the early 1970s. So there's a really interesting situation here, right? The 1970s are a really fascinating time where you have the inklings of a convergence of methods, right? Where epigraphy and archaeology or history and archaeology can start to talk to each other, you might say. But I would say it's still not really well formed. 1980 to me, more or less, is an important kind of turning point here. I say here bipolar Maya research before 1980. What do I mean by that? What I mean by that is that you still have these 2 different realms, you might say, methodologies. Epigraphy, history is starting to talk with archaeology, but it's not really well formulated. And it might just be, an example here, an example there. I do think Tikal is really key in this. Of course, the other project that's so important in all of this, as I'll talk about in a second, is Palenque. But let me illustrate this, right? Let me illustrate this disconnect, you might say, with looking at some important publications before 1980, right before 1980. These are books that are probably well known to many of the grad students out there and archaeologists. Social Process in Maya Prehistory in 1976, Prehistoric Mesoamerica by Dick Adams in 1977, and Maya Archaeology and Ethnohistory in 1979. Now, I point these out because they're using this idea of prehistory to describe the classic Maya, right? And that last book there, the 1979 publication, is not Maya Archaeology and History, it's Maya Archaeology and Ethnohistory, which is really looking at more the colonial documents and that kind of thing, right? So this is an era when there is still no widespread acknowledgement that ancient history exists as its own kind of complex texture of evidence that can be applied to archaeological interpretation. They're still rather divided, this changes very quickly, but I think the late 70s, the disco era, right, is kind of the time frame for some of these tensions to start to play themselves out. So prehistory, we don't use prehistory anymore to talk about the Maya, unless we're maybe talking about the late preclassic or something. But here we are, you know, it's commonly used. It's almost like a reflex to talk about prehistory when we're talking about the pre-conquest period. This does change very quickly. Now, a nice illustration of the change that does happen is Preskuriakov's book called Maya History, right? And this is a manuscript that's sitting around. You know, Tatiana Preskuriakov passes away. She dies in 1986. This is not published until the mid-1990s. And so people don't necessarily see it or absorb it. But she was working on a book called Maya History that really just didn't see the light of day. It's kind of unfortunate. I suspect she was writing much of this maybe not long after her Piedras Negras article, right? Looking probably in the late 60s and throughout the 70s, she's really working on this manuscript, but it doesn't really appear until after her death, which is very unfortunate. I think things might have changed a bit if that wasn't the case. So some of you may be wondering, why am I not talking about Palenque, right? Well, here we go. I'm going to talk about Palenque. Palenque is important, the scholarship at Palenque in this era. But I would say still that in 1980, we do still have this rather significant divide. I remember it well from, you know, being at conferences in that time period, between archaeology and epigraphy. Now, of course, needless to say, as many of you know, some of the great transformations that took place in Maya studies happened at Palenque in the early 70s, you know, right, kind of on the heels of the Tikal project and you know, right when Chris Jones, Clemency Coggins are working, and certainly we have at Palenque this new energy that appears, right? The first Mesa Redonda in 1973 is a major event. This is one of a few photographs I know of that really important meeting. There's Betty Benson standing from Dumbarton Oaks, right? She was an important organizer and kind of energy behind this, along with Merle Green Robertson and Mike Coe of Yale University, Gillette Griffin, who's there in the foreground. And of course, Linda Sheely was there, Peter Matthews, a lot of people were there, Jeff Miller, very important young scholars as well, who I think were catching the wave, right? They're catching this energy. Of course, Linda and Peter, you know, they were the ones who really crystallized this newfound approach of looking at inscriptions as history. And this is important, right? Peter Matthews, as we saw, Peter was Dave Kelly's student. right? Peter knew what was going on, through his own academic track. He was aware from Dave of these major kind of changes happening. And they were studying the inscriptions of Palenque. They were using Heinrich Berlin's early work and kind of distilling that into a much stronger reconstruction of the dynasty of Palenque, which they announced at the first Mesa Redonda. And I remember, I wasn't there. Believe me, I was not there. I would have been, 8 years old or something. But I remember my mom and dad went to the first Mesa Redonda of Palenque. My dad, George Stuart, my mom, Jean Stuart. And I do remember them coming back from that conference being super jazzed and super excited. Even though I had no idea what, my archaeology was all about. They were clearly communicating to me and us kids that, hey, this trip was great, all these new finds and so forth. And, Linda and Peter, as we all know, were the ones who were really channeling that. I also want to broaden out this a little bit, though, because the Mesa Redonda of Palenque was really energized, as I mentioned, by Betty Benson, Merle Green Robertson. Michael Coe is very important in all of this. Of course, Mike passed away just recently. And another participant in the Mesas Redondas for a number of years was Floyd Lounsbury. And, I think because Linda and Peter were so junior, they were so young, they didn't have, graduate degrees, right? They were kind of the young Turks of the field. Some people use that term even. Floyd and Mike were the established academics, right? And Floyd and Mike were the ones who were, blessing that work. And Floyd, of course, worked very closely with Linda and Peter. Mike was not an epigrapher, but he was very interested in what was going on with epigraphy. And this is a term that nobody uses anymore, but I remember it being used quite often, which was that this was the Yale School of Maya epigraphy, right? Because of Mike and Floyd being sort of the patrons of this, with Linda and Peter beneath them in a sense, just in terms of age and so forth. The Yale School was sort of a blanket term used in the 70s for this sort of new wave of epigraphy. Looking at history and looking intensively, especially at Palenque. Palenque was the focus of that. Mike Coe tells the story in his book, very well, Breaking the Maya Code. There's a lot about the history of Maya epigraphy that's not in that book, however. I might want to flesh that out a little bit. I was not at the first Mesa Redonda, but I was at, gosh, I don't even remember. I think I was at the third one. That was my first one in 1978. And here I am with Linda, who I developed a very close relationship with in these years, with my dad and with John Justison. This was when I gave my first paper at Palenque. And I won't get into how I got into this field. That's a long story in and of itself, but here I am enjoying myself with all these remarkable scholars and developing very close friendships with many of them. That same year, by the way, was when I attended the very first Maya workshop at Austin, here in Austin, in 1978, that Linda was invited to present by Nancy Troike at the Latin American Institute at Texas. And here you see the cover of the notebook for that, right? And it's a Palenque inscription. Palenque was the be all and end all of Maya epigraphy, at least at this era, right? Every Texas workshop for a number of years, 78, 79, 80, 81, 82, was only Palenque, right? And I think that's kind of an interesting take on this era as well. And I was working with Linda on all sorts of different projects, on Palenque, on a book we were going to write on Maya glyphs, which never appeared, but which really got my churning about a lot of decipherments and kind of the structure of the script. Here we are visiting Peter Matthews at Harvard on the steps of the Peabody Museum, I think with one of or a couple of Ian Graham's field drawing notebooks there. That's one in my lap, and we're talking about inscriptions. So jumping ahead, okay. Believe me, this will kind of, come to I hope, a narrative pretty soon. My own history in all of this, right? Non-academic, right? I'm a kid, right? I'm a teenager. And I'm not even viewing this as an academic discipline. I'm just like, I just love hieroglyphs and I love my archaeology. But I do eventually end up in the field on my own with projects, right, as a student. And the site of Copan is really key in all of this. I started working on Copan material in around 1984. Copan was, for me as a young student trying to learn Maya hieroglyphs in the late 70s and very early 80s, Copan was super hard. It was very impenetrable. The inscriptions were so complicated visually. And so when Linda and I were working together on this book on Maya, ancient Maya writing, it was going to be called, I decided to kind of dive into the Copan material and try to work out some things for myself and read up on it. And what happened here was kind of an interesting thing. Well, let me go back here. Eventually, the work at Copan, where Linda and I were working, this is where history, I think, really came into play in my archaeology, right? And it was especially in the late 80s. So what's the background for this? Well, when I was playing around with the Copan monuments and inscriptions, reading what little had been written about the dynastic history, Dave Kelly had identified rulers' names. There were Bertold Riese had identified some rulers' names. And Altar Q, this amazing monument, was of course really important. But I had been working on some of the early dynastic history. I wanted to show you all here, just kind of a lark, I guess. This is my notebook from 1984, where I'm identifying this particular ruler called Yashkukmo, and proposing that he was actually maybe even the first ruler of the kingdom. And I remember writing a long letter to a young archaeologist named Bill Fash about my interpretations of the dynastic history of Copan. And Bill, I met Bill at the AAA meetings the following year in DC, where I was living. And we hit it off, and Linda got involved. And Bill Fash and his wife Barb invited me and Linda down to Copan in the summer of 1986. And they were starting something called the Copan Mosaics Project. So here are Linda and me. I look like I'm about 40 years old because I had a scraggly beard here, but I'm only, I think, about, God, I don't know, 20, 21 years old. Not even that. Gosh, I don't know. I can't do the math. But there's me and Linda together in the Hotel Marina in Copan that summer. And just seeing the inscriptions at Copan, my first time there, it was a remarkable thing. It was a remarkable experience. A lot of it made sense all of a sudden. And the dynastic history became very clear. So we worked really closely. Here I am pointing at altar Q. That's an altar. That's a big stone I'm pointing at. A very awkward photo, right? There I am with the Yashkukmo right behind my arm and the 16th ruler Yashpasach that I'm pointing to. You all know Altar Q probably in its story, but it was really the armature for understanding the dynastic history. Bill and Barb were wonderful in accommodating epigraphic knowledge in the interpretations of Copan archaeology. Another important person who came a few years later to Copan was Bob Scherer from the University of Pennsylvania, who had worked at Tikal, worked at Quirigua. And Bill Fashion invited Bob to come investigate the earlier levels of the Acropolis of Copan and to do tunneling. And this emerged as a remarkable project in and of itself. One of the things that drove this project, I think, in Bill's mind, was that we have this dynastic history. We have this first ruler named Kinich Yashkukmo, but we had absolutely no archaeological evidence for him. And there was a real question in the 1980s as to whether Yash Kukmo was a real human being or a mythical founder, someone who really was made up by later Maya historians. We actually had these discussions, right, at the time. I was convinced he was real, but others did not. And remarkably, Bob, in a few short years, was able to prove the veracity of the written history. The discovery of the Margarita stucco here with the emblem name of Yash Kukmo. This created a really interesting dynamic, right? So that we had several concurrent field projects that eventually ended up at Copan. After the Copan Mosaics project, we had Ricardo Agurcia digging in Temple 16. We had Will Andrews working in the southern part of the site. Linda is there, this is our meeting in Santa Fe at the School of American Research, right? Where my archaeology can kind of trace its DNA. And here we are, Rebecca Story, David Webster, a lot of, we're all talking about Copan, and history is a big part of the interpretations. So a lot of stuff is gelling at this point. This is where I get my experiences in my archaeology in the late 80s. My buddy Joel Palka, who was on the crew back then, this is his excavation crew.
Hello, everyone. I think
He did. He did too.
Okay. We may have lost connection from Dr. Stuart. It looks like this is something that could have happened.
Actually,
Let-
text David.
Yeah, I'm gonna call
He
him.
may be. He's probably still talking.
I'm gonna call David.
Yeah.
Ask him to reconnect. Sorry. This is the kind of thing that can happen in these conferences. Now you can see the behind the scene of Maya the Playa web edition.
No.
Hey, Dave, I think we lost you. Any more? I don't know what happened. So can you try to reuse? Yeah, and can you? Okay, cool. Yeah, just hit. I don't know what happened. You may have like lost internet for like a hot second, and yep. All right, there you are.
There we go.
All right, you're back in. Yeah, we can see you. Excellent.
You're doing great, Dave.
It's a great talk. Looking for the second part. Looking forward to the second part.
Okay, you're muted.
You're muted now.
Sorry,
All right.
I'm back. My internet phased out. Okay,
So we were hearing about
share
Copan.
my screen again.
Yeah.
I'll get back to where I was. I'm droning on too long. I'm sorry, guys.
No, you're good. You have plenty of time. You're good.
Can you all see that?
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay. All right. So I just wanted to mention we're still plugging along on Copan material that goes back to the 80s, and the history archaeology convergence is going strong there. Now I'm going to go very quickly through this. I just wanted to mention in my own personal history after Copan, I went to grad school at Vanderbilt. I joined the Petesh Batun Archaeological Project. And the site of Dos Pilas was, I think, a place where I saw many of these ideas that I was thinking about at Copan really crystallizing beautifully also at a site that was relatively unknown. right? Unlike Copan. Copan had been excavated for a long, long time. And I wanted to mention here that the work that led up to that project was spearheaded by Steve Houston, who did his dissertation on Dos Pilas. And he went to Vanderbilt, and the project really started from his observations about the dynastic history. He had worked with Peter Matthews on some of this, in fact, earlier, so there's another connection. And, Steve, I think, illustrates this really powerful convergence of archaeology and epigraphy. A lot of us who work in this material, I get this all the time, oh, Dave, you're an epigrapher. You're just an epigrapher. I get that sometimes too. Steve is an archaeologist and he's an epigrapher. He's a lot of things. I think a lot of us who do this are a lot of things too. But I just wanted to point out this kind of, importance of Steve in that project and in, again, merging these two highways. And Vanderbilt, that was a great time for us. There were a lot of students who went through the project in those years. Joel Palka, who was on Copan with me. There's Takashi Inomata, Osvaldo Chinchilla, Barbara Arroyo, Sonia Medrano, a bunch of archaeologists pretty well established now, went through that program. We all went together and we were working, many of us at Dos Pilas together. So, this was a big learning experience. And I think just intellectually a very important time where epigraphy and field archaeology came together, even more than in Copan in some ways. I lost a lot of weight hiking around the jungle in those years, very skinny, like I certainly am not now. And we discovered new inscriptions at Dos Pilas that helped frame a lot of later historical interpretations. In fact, this hieroglyphic stairway that was found at Dos Pilas, Stairway 4 in 1990, really helped us understand broader geopolitics in Maya history, including the Canules, the Snake Kingdom, and all of that. It was really the moment, for me and Steve and for Simon and Nikolai Gruba, where we kind of realized, hey, there's a lot going on here in terms of geopolitics and hierarchies. I should mention too, Palenque being really important. This is a shorter, kind of smaller project that I was involved with Alfonso Morales. But Alfonso worked at Copan as well, right? He worked with Bob Scherer on the early Acropolis project, and he had the opportunity to direct excavations in Temple 19 at Palenque, where was discovered several amazing tablets, right? And this was a way also of kind of framing archaeology through a historical lens in a very direct way, maybe even overly historicized. There was probably a lot of archaeology we could have done if we had the opportunity there in that particular part of the site, looking at the history of the structure and kind of the kind of archaeology that Jocelyn was doing, for example, at La Corona. But hopefully that can be done in other buildings at Palenque. La Corona, I won't go over this because Jocelyn did such a wonderful job of talking about the history of this, but La Corona was another place where this stuff converges. And here we have me and Ian Graham in '97 when we kind of go through and document the monuments there, the Saknite, identifying it as Site Q and so forth. And I want to mention that Marcello, who started that project after Ian and I were there several years, he starts the excavations at La Corona. Of course, he was Bob Scherer's student working at Copan, right? This is important. This is an intellectual track, right? From this historicized Maya archaeology, it comes down into other sites, right? In Guatemala, much like Dos Pilas, right? Much like other ones as well. The Caracol project, I didn't mention that. That's also very important because Steve Houston had been there earlier in Belize before he was at Dos Pilas. So I wanted to mention the importance of the Caracol project as well. But I didn't work there, right? This is my personal take on some of this stuff. So working with Marcello, working with Jocelyn, working with Tomas, La Corona is a place of just endless fascination. And Jocelyn did a great job. I'm not going to even talk more about that. The 2012 block she described an incredible moment, it's true. And so much, little tidbits of my history have come out of that particular excavation that Jocelyn oversaw. So, the point here is that, we've been working together. We who kind of focus on Maya hieroglyphs, Simon, me, Steve, Mark Zender, many others, right? And this is an ongoing team effort in many ways, but we're involved with lots of different projects, kind of spread out all over the Maya world. And, the La Corona being one of them, Copan being another, right? We're all kind of working in many ways on this still, and writing up old results still. And new discoveries keep happening, right? Here's Max. I wanted to show Max, right? Here's Max and Marcello with discoveries at La Corona a few years ago. And a wonderful illustration of what I'm talking about here, and I promise I will shut up pretty soon. Marcello and Max and others on the La Corona project have really looked at the chronology of that site in terms of royal history, right? In terms of actual reigns of kings. There's not direct correspondence all the time, but notice here, for example, in the palace of La Corona, the construction phases of the palace correspond very nicely with historical reigns we know from the epigraphy, right? And to some extent, the ceramic phases do as well. Steve Houston tracked some of these same interrelationships at Piedras Negras, especially with ceramics, tying them into historical reigns, right? So that's really important. Finally, I wanted to mention one of the projects I'm working on right now is this, one of the most impressive of Maya sites, Xultun, near San Bartolo, right? It is immense. And it has some of the latest Maya monuments, and it has some early Maya monuments. Because of preservation, because of, bad luck, perhaps, we don't know a lot about the history of Xultun. And we don't know how it really ties in well to these other kingdoms, these networks of, the Snake Kingdom, the Kanuls and Tikal and others. But it's a limitation that we have, so it will be an interesting case study in my archaeology of how we can link it to other kinds of data, right? Not relying on epigraphy, or not necessarily bringing epigraphy in all the time. And I think that's important to point out, right? It's not just about glyphs. It's not just about inscriptions and royal history. There's a lot of other things as well. So finally, a broader point is my last slide. I don't think my archaeology is a historical archaeology in the way we often think of that expression. I see it as something a bit more complicated. As I say here, it's broader and richer than that. There's a constellation of approaches, right? And where we have historical sources and inscriptions, certainly that keys into the data, but it's not always going to be there. So Jocelyn made this point as well, right? We have to go beyond epigraphic data to look at a lot of broader questions. I guess my main point here is that this change that we've seen in the last 40 plus years, it's one that's really unique in American archaeology. This may be obvious to some folks, but nowhere else outside of the old world, outside of the Mediterranean world or maybe China, can we talk about long-term history? Can we talk about, many, many centuries of dynastic history and tie it into these other kinds of information? I think the closest thing we can really link Maya studies to is something like classics, right? Which is this very kind of, it's an old field that is trying to transform and come out of itself, on the other side. But I think my archaeology in a funny way is approaching what classics is or was, or maybe we're kind of coming together in some ways. But that's, I'm going to stop right there because it's way too long. And I apologize for that, but I will now stop sharing my screen, and thanks to you all. I'm sorry I went over, folks.
Oh,
There we are.
David, do not worry. This was a great presentation, and you were not even over time.
No.
You were
Oh, I'm not? Okay. All right.
on the spot. You're good. You're good. You're good.
My cat left, by the way. I don't know where.
Oh, but maybe that's why you're angry. But no, I'm joking. No, it's perfect. Actually, we have 10 full minutes.
Okay.
For question and answers before our next slated talk. Which, by the way, we just realized. We will not have Christophe personally introduce his film, but we have a premiere film here right now to present from Christophe at 8.
Oh, is he not presenting, or is he?
No, he's sleeping.
He's sleeping because it is like 3 a.m. in
Not bad.
Denmark.
Okay.
But he sent us a very cool film to share. We have a question here
But
by.
you didn't let me do that?
Say what?
You didn't let me do that?
No, yeah, we didn't let you because you don't have the 3 a.m. argument.
Oh, okay, okay.
Thank you, though. That was actually a really cool talk. And no, seriously, it's really cool. Those photos were really precious. A lot of them. And,
yeah, I want to thank Joel Palka and Marcello for sending me some photos at very short notice, and Elaine Sheely also.
Awesome.
So,
awesome.
Yes.
Yeah, no, I think at some point there will be a dire need for a new breaking the Maya code version kind of thing.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, no, there does need to be that.
Mm-hmm.
I agree.
Cool. I wonder who could write it. Anyway, so no, I don't want to add anything to your list. I have personal stake in this. So let's go. And there's a first question here by someone named Anonymous Attendee who says, "Wonderful talk, Dave. Just a brief shout out for another figure important in the 1970s and later, Will Andrews. Although not an epigrapher himself, rather an archetypal dirt archaeologist, he invited various budding epigraphers, to speak at Tulane, such as Linda, before she moved to Texas, whom he also put up at his house. Will, as editor of the Mari publications, was receptive to publishing work on iconography, epigraphy, and history, such as work by Clemency Coggins, Vicky Bricker, and others. Perhaps this was due in part to Will's father,
Bill.
Will, and Bill,
Who was best friends with my dad, by the way.
Bill, that's right. Who hired your dad to work at Sibyl Chaltoon.
Who hired my dad to work at Sibyl Chaltoon in 1958. Yeah, and so yeah, like it's all connected, right?
But I saw Will Andrews in the photo.
So Will joined the Copan project, as I very briefly mentioned, and he's in that black and white photo of us in Santa Fe.
Yeah.
And Will, that was a really important Tulane project. We had Tulane, we had Penn at Copan in those years. We had, Bill and Barbara Fash. I was kind of floating around between all of these, as was, Linda and Nikolai was there. And, there was just a lot of, and Ricardo Agurcia had his own excavations, and so we were this kind of extended team of multiple projects. Penn State was there for a time, and Dave Webster was digging, and they had an earlier project at Copan, so they were continuing. It was amazing, to live in Copan Ruinas, in the town there, and have, all the students and established archaeologists from 4 different projects, Bob and Will and Bill and Barb and Ricardo and me and David Sadat. And, it was quite a time in the late 80s, early 90s.
I think someone tied to this project has just commented saying, "Thanks, Dave. That's Loa Traxler."
Hey, Loa.
And the Penn thread carries through with Steve Houston, who, of course, did his undergrad at Penn.
That's very true. I didn't mention this. Steve Houston was Bob Scherer's undergraduate student at Penn. So there's a flow chart somebody somewhere has to make of all these associations.
And myself being the student of Marcello, who was a student of Bob. I guess I have some grandfathership inheritance from there. Okay, we have another question here. Alvaro MD says, "Thanks a lot for your presentation. It was great. Given your experience through the development of the discipline, where do you see Maya studies going in the next 5 to 10 years? Also, what would be an up-to-date book on Maya political history?" Well, I think that.
Oh, yeah. Well, I can answer. I'll answer that second question. It's getting a little out of date because it's about a month old now. But
yes, a month.
Simon Martin's book on Maya political history, I think.
It's called Ancient Maya.
Ancient Maya
Politics.
Yeah,
Yeah,
Ancient Maya
ancient Maya
politics.
politics.
Well, it's so new, I can't even remember the title. But it's a tremendous work. I don't want to embarrass Simon, who may be listening, but I'll embarrass him. I think it's it's a very expensive book, unfortunately, but it's one of the most important books to come out in the last few decades. It's a crystallization of Simon's very sensitive analysis of Maya geopolitics and political history. Now, it's not a narrative history of Maya kingdoms, right? I will mention that, the Chronicle of Maya Kings and Queens, book that many of us have, it's now, a couple of decades old, but, that was transformational, of course. It brought together a lot of data we had all been working on. And just a few months ago, I signed a book contract with Princeton Press to write a book called The Ancient Maya, A New History. And it's going to be a popular, accessible, I hope, narrative of the classic Maya, but looking at not just the kings and queens, but looking at broader issues as well. So I'm in the midst of all of that right now. It should be out in a couple of years.
I think that another good book too is not as recent, but Antonia Foyas' take on classic Maya politics is also very good as well.
Yeah.
But yeah, to come back to
part of
the tough part of the question though is given your experience through the
where we're going,
where do you see Maya studies going in the next 5 to 10 years?
I think this is a very hard time for everybody, including Maya archaeologists who can't go to the field in anytime soon. It'll be interesting to see how this affects all of us in terms of field work and supporting students and getting other projects going. And I don't even want to imagine that. But I think, look, as I was kind of racing to say at the end, I think we're at a very healthy place in Maya studies. The arguments and the tensions, and I probably downplayed that. In the 1970s and 80s, between a number of archaeologists who were trained to be skeptical of history, right? To be skeptical of the written word, to be skeptical of quote unquote propaganda and so forth, right? I get that, I understand that, and it comes out, as I was saying, of this Americanist archaeological intellectual history. Very different from people trained in England or trained in Europe. But in America, if you're studying archaeology, history has nothing to do with it, right? You're studying, Lou Binford and bison kills, and you're studying, some other, I'm exaggerating, right? But what I'm saying is that a lot of Maya archaeologists who dived into Maya material were just, I think, not trained. I don't want to use that word necessarily, but they were not. History just had no role to play intellectually in what they were looking at.
Actually, Dave, there's a perfect question that just ties perfectly into this point you're making.
Yeah.
So Miguel Pimenta Silva says, it was a fantastic presentation as always, Dr. Stuart. I would like to ask you, can you talk a little about the relationship with other European epigraphers of your generation, such as Alfonso Lacadena, Eric Bolt, Nikolai Gruber, and Dmitry Believ, many others in the 90s? Thank you so much.
Right. No, great question. So yeah, I was giving my kind of very particular biographical kind of sketch here, right? So Nikolai joined us in Copan and I met him in one of the Mesas Redondas, I think in 86 or so. And he came to Copan very quickly after that. And he was clearly looking at this in much the same way, right? His approach to things was very similar. And one of the things I should mention is that in the 70s, right, the Yale School, which is sort of what created the methods we use now, or I don't know what to call it, the North American school, some people have said, there was a school of epigraphy in Germany in those years, Thomas Bartel and others, that was really not about phoneticism. They didn't agree with anything Konorosov did. The other thing I want to mention is there was a Russian school of epigraphy, we might say, in the 70s and 80s that was Konorozov and his students and his followers that had nothing to do with the epigraphy we do today. I don't think I'm exaggerating that. Despite the fact that Konorozov had made those breakthroughs in the 1950s, identifying syllabic writing, if you took an inscription that Konorozov was translating in 1980 or in the 1970s, and one that we were working on, they would have looked like apples and oranges. It's fascinating, right? So I guess the point I'm making is that there were some very innovative and rather independent thinking young scholars like Nikolai and Alfonso as well, La Cadena, who came to the Texas meetings, who were in those years, pre-internet. Let's remember, right? This is how you communicated, was sort of physically having to come to places like Austin, and that was what I think fostered a lot of the ideas and methods we assume today, right? So many of us who teach courses on Maya glyphs, we all teach the same stuff. We teach it all the same way, pretty much. I mean, we all agree on pretty much everything. That's remarkable in and of itself, but I didn't quite make this point. In the 1980s, that would not have been the case. And I think it's a very healthy sign for our field. So the European, the energy from a lot of the younger or contemporary with me European scholars was tremendous and vital. And well, now, there's a synergy that's global in terms of Maya glyph studies.
I wonder if maybe in 10 years we also will get a much more kind of subtle understanding of kind of the more heterogeneous landscape of the classic Maya through linguistic work, for example, and through increased survey and archaeological work that will really give us a better idea of how complex this geopolitical landscape was, and integrated in a way that will be reflected in popular books, where we won't really talk about the ancient Maya, but really the ancient Mayas as these myriads of states.
Well, this is what I'm struggling with. When I signed this book contract, in my history, I was like, oh shit, because how do you write this as a cohesive narrative when you have, Palenque, you have Ekbalam, you have, Kupan, and how do you weave that together? Well, you can't necessarily. There are threads you can track between all of that from time to time, but it's not a single historical narrative that they're producing for others to read. It's very eclectic. It's very, it's the same writing system. They're keyed into each other, but all history is local in a lot of ways, right? Mm-hmm. So you especially get a sense of this up in Yucatan, right? We don't talk about Yucatan so much when we talk about history, but look at Tipochaltun. We have important dynastic records there. Ekbalam, Koba. I just, in terms of the future, I don't know. I mean, I don't have the magic glasses to look forward like that, but I think we're in a healthy place because we agree on the fundamentals.
Yeah.
If you're an epigrapher now, you agree with how to read this stuff, and I have to remind myself from time to time how special that is, that the stuff that we were doing in the 70s and 80s is now like, it's common knowledge, but it's just assumed knowledge. It's like you don't even think twice about it, right? But we were struggling with the basics in 1983, and how the structure of the script actually worked. And this is why we had these different approaches, whether it was in Moscow or in Germany or here in the States. There was just a lot of disagreement, arguments in the Mesas Redondas early on,
And I guess something else. We'll have, there's a very strong rising scholarship in Latin America as well. From
Absolutely.
papers.
Yeah.
So I think also we'll get some more perhaps localized.
Well, that's what I mean by being global. Is we have tremendous scholars in Mexico and Guatemala, and again, you know, colleagues who are pushing in brand new directions everywhere. You know, I'm an old fogey now. You know, I'm one of the old set.
You don't look too old.
And it's like, you know, but it's part of that is troubling, maybe part of that's kind of like, wait a minute, you know, but it's also wonderful. It's wonderful to see that it's vibrant, and it's there are people I don't even know very well who are reading my hieroglyphs and making insights.
Mm-hmm.
You know, which is kind of weird for me to say, because 20, 30 years ago, we all knew each other. Like, it was this sort of tight group, or you know, we were sending letters to each other, you know, mailing them, typing them on a typewriter and mailing them off to Steve House. You know,
Mm-hmm.
that was how we communicated back in the day.
Well,
so,
thank you so much, Dave, for this presentation.
Yeah.
I think this was great. A very good retrospective, I guess, on the past two cartoons of Maya epigraphy and the marriage with archaeology, which gives us, I guess, what Simon Martin has called archaeopolitics in some ways, or other ways,
yeah,
historical Maya archaeology. So this is wonderful.